This took place in upstate New York when I was around 5 years old. My mom and I had just moved into a new house and came from Florida as she had found better job opportunities up here. The house wasn't anything too special. It was just an appropriate sized house for 1 or 2 people, making it perfect for both my mom and I. Anyway, on with the actual story. It was Christmas Eve night and my mom and I had just finished eating our dinner. After dinner, she whispered in my ear telling me that if I went to bed now, that Santa would bring me something special in the morning. Now, of course, being in my 5-year-old state, I obliged and ran straight to my room and fell asleep within the hour. It was hard falling asleep considering the amount of excitement I had in me, but I thankfully ended up falling asleep. I woke up around 4 or 5 in the morning, feeling really thirsty, so I got out of bed and into the kitchen to get a glass of water. As I'm approaching the kitchen, I happened to look out the window and saw someone standing outside in the snow in our backyard. I of course freaked out, but still took a closer look. He was tall, maybe around 6'3", and was wearing all black and a hat. As mentioned before, I was only 5 at the time, so I thought that it might have been Santa Claus, even though he wasn't wearing anything that resembled Santa. However, I still jumped with excitement and ran into my room to wake my mom up. She of course was in a grumpy mood, but she still followed me to where I thought I saw Santa. She looked out of the window, and I saw her eyes open wide while rushing me back into her room, locking the door. I remember her grabbing her cell phone and start talking with the police, explaining what I showed her. When the police came, whoever it was already gone and was never found. It wasn't until a few years later that the conversation was brought up again, and my mom then told me something I didn't know. My mom managed to notice that whoever that was hiding something behind their back that they didn't want either of us to see. I still sometimes wonder what could have happened to me and my mom had I not have woken up thirsty that night to get a glass of water. There are still 3 unanswered questions I still have till this day. Why were they in our backyard? What were they hiding behind their back? And what would they have done to us had they managed to get inside our house? So, this happened in the 90s in Miami during the Christmas holiday break when I was around 7 or 8. A tiny bit of personal backstory. My great-grandmother's second husband ended up sexually abusing his grandkids. They happened to be my aunts and my father's for over a decade, but it was never discovered or spoken about until after he had passed away. But, as we all know, that kind of abuse can seriously alter your view of the world around you. In this case, it made my family strict and sensitive about protecting me, and I wasn't allowed to be outside alone or sleep over at anyone's house. Since I was born, my grandma had always lived with us. Before I was school-aged, I'd stay home alone with her during the day, and once I began school, she would watch me whenever we had summer or holiday breaks. She was a southern red-haired firecracker who took no crap from anyone, but had the biggest soft spot for me. So this winter break, I had just got new rollerblades for Christmas, and I was going up and down the pavement practicing. My grandma was on the porch reading and watching me when the house phone rang. She debated having me come inside while she went to answer it, but I pleaded to stay as I was finally getting the hang of it. She reluctantly agreed and went inside to answer it, but she left the main door open so that she could still see me through the screen door. It took a few minutes for her to return, but during that time, nothing had happened, so I think she was more at ease. She returned to her book, and I was now working on learning a few tricks. After maybe another half hour or so, she said it was time for lunch and we had to go inside. I begged her to just let me play a little bit longer and promised that when she was done finishing her lunch, I would come inside, no questions asked. She stood there watching me for a bit, but then agreed and again went inside, leaving the screen door open, and told me to sing while I skated so that she could hear me. Moments later, a white van came down the street very slowly. They seemed lost, but I didn't pay much attention because I was a kid unaware of the evils of the world. Plus, I was on the other side of the chain-linked fence, so I was safe. Even when it rolled up and stopped right in front of the house, I kept on skating. It wasn't until the passenger door opened and an extremely tall man stepped out and asked me which way was the highway. Being polite, I told him the direction. He then made some small talk that I can't really recall, but it was along the lines of, how was my Christmas, what did Santa bring me, etc. He then asked if I wanted to have the toys that his daughter didn't want, which was a Barbie house. I was still silent because now I was scared. The way he looked at me was dark. He was smiling, but his eyes seemed both joyful and vicious, which still unnerves me till this day. He slowly came closer and closer to the gate and asked if I wanted to check out the toy. This is exactly what they taught about stranger danger in school and at home. I ignored him and began to skate backwards towards the door, not wanting to take my eyes off him, but also not wanting to yell as I didn't want to be rude if he was really just a nice guy. He came closer to the point where he was only a few feet away from the gate and asked if my parents were home. All thoughts of politeness vanished, and I panicked, yelled for my grandma, and tried to run inside, which landed me promptly on my back. At the exact same moment, he unlatched the gate to come inside, and before he could get to me, my grandma came bursting through the door with a cast iron skillet in hand, cursing. He looks up, sees her, and bolts. He hopped back in the van, and before the door could close properly, the driver was speeding down the street. My grandma bypassed me completely and ran after the van, screaming at them. She picked me up and carried me inside and called the police and my dad, asked what happened. 10 minutes later, I'm with the paramedics, getting my scraped elbows patched up while my grandma spoke with the police. My dad showed up soon after, and I didn't go outside the rest of the break. Years later, in my late teens, it came up one Christmas in the conversation, and I got more of the story. It turns out, my grandma was on the edge more than normal, because there had been a man who had broken into a woman's apartment in Broward and had been assaulted just before Christmas. We don't know if they ever caught him, or them, since I'm sure whoever was driving the van was 100% down with whatever evil plan that man had for me. When I was in my late 20s, I used to live alone in a small 2-bedroom house in a relatively secluded area in Tennessee. The closest neighbors to me lived about 5 or 6 miles away from my house, so I was pretty much isolated from everyone. Anyway, it was Christmas Eve and I was getting the house nice for some of my relatives to come over for dinner. They'd be coming from Nashville, which is about a 3-hour drive away, so that gave me plenty of time to get everything set up. Now, my house had a fireplace, and I was planning on getting some firewood from the woods out back to light it. Not many fireplaces around these days, but they exist. It's around 7 p.m., and it was practically dark out at this point, with very little light outside, so I desperately tried to find some good usable firewood for the fireplace. I'm picking up a few branches and sticks when I get a strange feeling in the pit of my stomach. I felt as if I was being watched from the woods, but seeing as it was dark and it was snowing heavy, there was a very slim chance that would be the case. Anyway, at this point, I had collected enough wood, and I'm starting to head back to the house. That's when I hear a very loud, bone-chilling, terrifying scream from somewhere in the woods. I stopped dead in my tracks, clearly stiff as a board, trying to figure out what I just heard. It didn't even sound normal. In fact, the closest word I could describe it as would be deranged. I immediately dropped the wood in the snow and ran toward my house and shut the front door and then locking it. Breathing heavily, I tried to calm myself down by focusing on finishing up the decorations and putting the idea of the fire for the last thing on my mind. About an hour later, my guests finally came, but I never did end up telling them about what I had heard, thinking that they would think I'm crazy or insane. But I know what I heard. It didn't even sound human. This happened to me when I was a little boy, around 7 or 8 years old. I lived with my mom during this time, as my dad was verbally and physically abusive to her and was also a major alcoholic. My past childhood was a total disaster because of my dad. Him and my mom would get into extreme arguments, and police had to be called a couple times a week due to his outbursts. At one point, my mom stood up for herself and eventually filed a restraining order against him, forcing him to leave the house, and we still don't know where he is till this day. Anyway, it was Christmas Eve night around 12 p.m. My mom was asleep and I was in bed trying to fall asleep so I could wake up to the surprise of gifts from Santa in the morning. Fast forward to around 2 o'clock. I had slept for at least a good 2 hours or so when I for some reason woke up hungry. This wasn't too common as this only happened a few times before, but I didn't want to go to bed hungry, so I got out of bed to go grab a cookie my mom and I made earlier. As I'm walking to the kitchen, I looked to my left and was relieved to see that presents had been placed under the Christmas tree. I looked at them for about a good minute and then continued my walk to the kitchen. And that's when I saw someone crouched down by her food pantry dressed in all black. He was holding what I could only describe as a large knife. By some stupid luck, he didn't see me as he was facing the opposite direction. Now, in my 7-year-old state, I thought it was Santa Claus, but I didn't want to be seen by him, so I quickly ran back up to my room and into my bed. 10 minutes later, I woke up again. But not from hunger, but rather the sound of my mom screaming. I ran to her room and was greeted to a disturbing scene. The man from earlier was standing over my mom's bed while putting his hand over her mouth, preventing her from screaming. When he saw me, he put his fingers to his lips and said, "Shh." I practically fell onto the floor, crying my eyes out as this nightmare guy kept trying to do God knows what to my mom. By some stroke of luck, I heard loud banging at the front door, followed by loud yelling from people claiming to be the police. I opened the front door, and one of the officers, who was a female, comforted me while the other 2 male officers went into my mom's room, putting the man to the ground. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The police came out with the man in handcuffs, asking me if I knew this man. I didn't. I'll never forget the look the man gave me as he was forced into the back seat of the police car. It was a look of pure hatred and anger, like the first thing he would do once he got out of jail would be to come back for us. The police talked to my mom, and my aunt and uncle ended up coming to stay with us for a few days. It turns out, our neighbors saw this man come into our house with a key, and they then called the cops. I don't know how in the world he managed to get a key, and that's the thing that still haunts me till this day. Screw that guy for attempting to rape my own mother, and thank you to my neighbor and those kind police officers for preventing him from something potentially horrible happening to us.